Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of Tapping into Culture, brought to you by VinePair and Sixpoint. I'm Kat Wolinski, VinePair's senior editor, and I'm joined today by Sixpoint's Mac Finance.
Hi, thanks for having us.
And our special guest, Averie Swanson. Averie is famously just an awesome person in the beer world. She's the founder of Keeping Together Beer, which is based in Chicago. She is formerly of Jester King, and she is also a master cicerone, one of, I believe, 19 in the entire world, which is crazy. So I thought, and we all agreed, that Averie would be the perfect person to talk about today's topic, which is sour beer, one of the most kind of confusing and often misunderstood types of beer out there. But before we get into today's topic, I would love it if you could tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself, Averie, and what's going on with Keeping Together.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I don't know if I'm the perfect person to talk about sour beer, but I'm definitely enthusiastic about it. So, yeah, I've been here in Chicago for a couple of years. Moved up here from Austin, where I was working down at Jester King for a long time as the head brewer down there. Moved up here and started a new beer label, mixed fermentation, saison focused beer label called Keeping Together. And I am more or less just kind of making saison. Obviously the last year has been kind of slow going in the way of events and sales and things like that, but Chicago's a pretty thirsty city, so I'm grateful to be here. Yeah, that's more or less it, just kind of slow and steady.
Yeah, not much of the usual launch events and happenings when you open, basically in a pandemic, so that's understandable. But I know that you are making saisons, another beer style that many of us love and many other people are curious about and maybe don't quite understand. So I think it's especially interesting, and why I thought you'd be great to come on today, because saisons can be sour beers, right? But not all saisons are sour beers. Not all sour beers are saisons. There's a lot of kind of crossover there. So I suppose, firstly, why don't we start with how you define sour beer personally?
That is a good question. And it's one that I've struggled with over the years. Starting out at Jester King, where we were more or less known for our sour beers, the barrel-aged sour beers, and eventually our spontaneously fermented beer made in the style of Belgian Goose. I don't know, I struggled with how to define sour beer to people. I think I put up some resistance to calling sour beers because I felt like it didn't do justice to all of the different traditions that were encompassed by that overarching kind of descriptive name. I think I've warmed up to it, or chilled out maybe a little bit over the years, and I'm a little bit less concerned with making sure that we're honoring the tradition every time we talk about a sour beer. At the end of the day, if you work in service or if you work in a brewery, you just want to be able to facilitate a really positive experience for your guests and for beer consumers. So, if when I say it's a sour beer, people have a better understanding of what exactly it is that's in their glass, then I'm all for using that descriptor. I would say on the most basic level, saying sour beer means that the beer in your glass is going to be fairly acidic, tart, sour, these are all kind of words that mean the same thing. I would say that sour beer is similar to like an IPA or similar to a barley wine, in that it kind of showcases one of the 5 general flavors in a really focused way. So whereas an IPA traditionally would have been focusing on like the bitter component or the bitter flavor element in that beer, where a barley wine might focus a little bit on the sweetness or the malt complexity in that beer, a sour beer is going to have that acidity profile front and center, and that's where the complexity is really going to live.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. I hadn't really thought of it that way before. And it's like easier to think about malt being malt and hops being hops, but where's that acidity coming from that makes a beer sour? Max, you want to jump in here?
I was just going to say, that's why we have to get the Master Cicerone on here to illuminate things in a new way. Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of the same sentiment that Avery was talking about, and I think it's sort of been a pet peeve of mine that the way that consumers sometimes, and even beer geeks, tend to use this overarching descriptor of sour to talk about 20 different styles of beer, when really it's not necessarily the best way to lump them all together. We're just talking about a very elemental flavor part of the profile.
Right.
A style as non-sour as a Belgian wit beer could have an element of acidity to it, but you wouldn't call a wit beer a sour beer. Whereas, lumping things like Goose and Goza, even though they sound the same and people sometimes get them confused, very, very different production methods and different end results in terms of the flavor profile too. So I try to be a little bit more descriptive and zeroing in on individual styles when I'm talking about sour beers. But just like Avery was saying, at the end of the day, it's beer, so we can't get too worked up about these things, and we have to remember that, like, if the word sour is going to help convey to a consumer or a customer or just a fan of ours what it is about the flavor profile that they're really going to enjoy or might want to steer away from on a certain beer, then that's helpful information too.
Yeah, I would like to stop you there and put you on the spot to describe the difference between a Goza and a Goose for those who don't know, because that's a perfect example of, like, not only are these two things that can be called sour, but they sound the same and are totally different.
Totally different, right? And this
and
really
different, by the way.
This really opens us up to, like, this really deep rabbit hole that we could go down in terms of production methods. And I don't know how far we want to get into that. I will quickly throw the ball to Avery if we start talking about brewing techniques.
Burrow a little bit into the hole, I think.
But a Goza is a traditionally German style of sour beer, and it's a little bit salty, a little bit acidic, often coriander, and a really nice low alcohol, the sort of thing that could be a summer crusher type of style. Sixpoint has done one for years and years called Jammer, which you won't see this summer, but taking it into a short-term break for a little while we bring back another favorite summer beer. But Goose, on the other hand, is a Belgian style. So we've gone from Germany to Belgium, and we've gone from this more easy drinking, refreshing, a little bit more of a simplistic sour profile, sort of a one-note lactic sourness in a Goza. And then you talk about Goose, and it's a much more complicated fermentation. Often in Belgium, traditionally, it would start with a coolship and an open fermentation where you're basically gathering the local microflora from that climate to, as the wort cools down, you're inoculating it with really whatever's in the air. You're not adding a brewer's yeast to that beer. So in addition to those lactic sour components, you could develop all sorts of Brettanomyces flavors, other bacteria and microbes, flavoring the beer, and you end up with a much more complex sourness to it, where you get a lot of barnyard characteristics. Could be cherry pie or pineapple, or one of dozens of different flavors that could come from Brettanomyces, and this whole plethora of microbes that are really contributing to that much more complex
I'm just picturing
system of flavors.
Eating a cherry pie in a barnyard, and I'm like, yep, that pretty much nails it. Yeah, I mean,
awesome.
it's a completely different process. I mean, it takes years in some cases, or you have young Goose and old Goose, and blend them together in their lambic, and then make that in the U.S. and it's not really a lambic. I mean, that's the part of the rabbit hole that we won't go down right now. But I think there is something more understandable about the acidity to those flavors and why a lot of people do enjoy these flavors. And it's easy to gravitate to sour beers if you're not someone who necessarily geeks out about all these things like we do. Something that we've talked about before is that a lot of wine drinkers tend to gravitate towards sour beers or beer styles that have sour or tart flavors. Avery, could you speak a little bit more to that similarity and why you think that is?
Yeah, certainly. I do think that there's a lot of overlap between many different types of wine and sour beer, kind of like as a category. There's the obvious one of acidity. Most wines have got a fairly high level of acidity to them, even if that's not something that you're tasting when you're sipping on your wine. You're not like, man, this wine is very sour. But in reality, it will likely have a pretty low pH and a fairly high level of acidity to it, even though that's not the prominent flavor element. There's also you know, in a lot of wines and in some sour beers, you'll get an overlap in like oak character or barrel character. And for a lot of wine drinkers, that's something that they really enjoy in their wine. A little bit of that like vanilla or coconut character from an American oak barrel, some tannic character. So there's a textural element there that I think some winemakers or wine drinkers find an affinity for in sour beer. There's also kind of less about the product and more about like the set and setting that a lot of people are enjoying wine in is at like the dinner table. So where wine has a very established place at the dinner table because people think that it pairs really well with food. Sour beer in general pairs really well with food too, but that's a broader conversation that we can have. But sour beer does all of the things that a wine could do when it comes to pairing, plus a little bit more, in my opinion. Not all wine is carbonated, obviously. Most sour beer is going to have at least a little bit of effervescence, with the exception of lambic. So that carbonation offers another element to a food pairing that I think is really positive. So I think that that is something to consider too.
Definitely.
I don't know. I think that a lot of people that drink wine are kind of like, maybe they gravitated towards wine because they had really terrible beer experiences when they were in college, you know, drinking beer at like a kegger or something, and it just being like flat, bitter, gross, like not totally cold beer. And they're like, I don't like beer because that's the experience that I had. So I drink wine. But I think a lot of wine drinkers, especially, you know, younger wine drinkers that are a bit more open to kind of cross-category drinking, are realizing that there's a lot of flavor to be had in the beer world, and it isn't just that terrible beer experience that you had in college. You can find a beer for just about anybody.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's almost everyone who doesn't like beer. It's because they just haven't had the beer that they like. They haven't had the right beer. And a lot of us get started in our beer drinking years by drinking nothing but those types of beers that you mentioned in the worst possible ways. So, I mean, like beer pong flashbacks, like, yeah, we had a ping pong ball bouncing around the floor going into the cup, and I was drinking out of the cup. What was wrong with us? We thought it was a sport. I was a champion, by the way. But yeah, I think it's funny because I've been tasting wine more lately in my own job and personal life, and it's so funny to me that you never hear wine described as sour. And like, that's my entry point is the opposite, where I'm like, oh man, like I'm really getting that tart, lemony, like back of the palate kind of sensation from something like a Sauvignon Blanc. That's, you know, something I've had, and maybe a mixed fermentation Saison that was super tart and also smelled like lemon and grapefruit. And it's just an interesting, like, kind of back and forth. I think it's important for people to not necessarily be having like these thoughtful conversations with themselves every time they drink different beverages, but to kind of keep things in context and like think about how something tastes compared to something else you've had, as a kind of way to get into other types of beers. What do you guys think?
Yeah, for sure. I think that for a lot of consumers, you know, sour beers, especially if you're not like a beer geek, like you said, you know, Kat, like we tend to be on this call, I think sour beers tend to live in a place that's a little bit less accessible to your run-of-the-mill six-pack drinker who goes out and buys something off the shelf at a beer store. A lot of the terminology on the package, even just not knowing what to expect, I think it can be a little bit intimidating. So when you're in an environment where a bartender can say, you know, this is a beer that might go really well with the dinner you're having. Would you like to try this? That can really open a lot of doors and open people's minds to the idea that, wow, holy cow, there's this whole spectrum of flavors in beer that I never really anticipated. You know, as Avery was alluding to, I think beer is really, really good for that.
Yes, absolutely. I love what you said, Avery, too, about having this type of beer is like one that's on the table. I mean, all beer is on the table in my house and probably yours, but that is, you know, flavor wise and also visually, a lot of times a sour beer or a beer that is sour will come in like a beautiful bottle with nice packaging. Sometimes it's corked and caged or corked and capped. I think you might have a bottle on you, right, Max, Avery? Maybe you could show like some examples of what types of sour beers you're drinking.
So I've got a 6-point bottle, and this is one of our small batch release program, Funky Spritzer from actually a couple years ago. But this was a cork and cap bottle, like you were just talking about. So
Ooh, it's open.
it is open. It's in my glass.
Nice. So what does this one taste like? Tell us, like, briefly what you think.
Yes, so this one really started out as like a mixed fermentation, long barrel aging, picking up a lot of acidity and sourness and complexity in barrels, but it does have a ton of that oak character to it. And then we added Gewürztraminer grapes as well, so it re-fermented on Gewürztraminer grapes. So it talk about crossover with the wine world, really picking up on some of those vinous notes and same characteristics you would expect in a white wine, except it's a beer.
Yeah, that sounds great. Avery, could you?
It does sound nice.
I guess one question I have for you, Avery, is where right now can you find Keeping Together beers? And kind of a part two to that question is, why are these types of beers not so available in grocery stores and like larger retailers like that most people are aware of?
So currently, I am not doing a ton in the way of distribution. I am making beer in Chicago, brewery here, Half Acre. So I'm selling everything pretty exclusively through their bottle shop and tap room these days. I've sent a small amount out. I've got some good friends out in Washington, D.C. Over at Ancho Co-op, and they might have some of my bottles still available right now. I sent them some stuff for Women's Month this month. So outside of Chicago, that would be probably the only place you could find them.
Ancho is a cidery, correct?
Mm-hmm,
they're like kind of
but they've got a pretty awesome bottle shop, and they
do really cool stuff there.
Yeah, their cider's fantastic, and they're really good people. And they're, back in the day when you could go sit down and eat at places, that was always one of my favorite spots in DC. They've got a great like tapas menu and just a great ambiance, and they're really good folks. So if you're in the area, I would highly recommend checking them out. And then to answer the second part of your question, even if I was distributing my beer outside of Chicago in a regular capacity, I probably would not be interested in having my beer at grocery stores generally. I do think that the type of beer that I make, though it is pretty easy to be around, easy to drink, fairly balanced, it's not the most like esoteric type of beer. It is, I use some kind of unconventional ingredients in some of the beers. They're beers that require a little bit of explanation. And, when you walk through the beer shelves or the beer aisles in your grocery store, the likelihood of there being somebody who's going to like take you on that journey and tell the story of that product, it's not likely to happen. And when I'm making such a small volume of beer, and I am making a very small volume, last year I think I made maybe 100 barrels of beer, which is very, very small in the grand scheme of things. There's not much to go around, and what does go around requires a little bit of a story. So, I would much prefer to sell my beer out of retail locations where I have a relationship with the people there, where I can go and tell the story, with folks that are enthusiastic and excited about it as well. So I really wanted my beers to be a bit more experiential. There's more to it than just like cracking a bottle and sitting down by yourself and enjoying it, though you can absolutely do that. I personally enjoy the more communal aspect of beer, and that is very much kind of in my mind when I'm making beer.
Hence the name, Keeping Together. That's a really beautiful
Exactly.
sentiment, and I totally agree. I can't wait to be able to do that again.
While we're talking about Avery's beers, I'll give her a little plug because I don't know if it'll still be available by the time this episode gets released, but I do know Avery just did a collaboration beer with Equilibrium in New York State. And that is currently for sale on their website. So
we're in New York. Oh my God, I'm getting it.
Make the trek up to Equilibrium, or I even think they do shipping through their website. Inside New York State.
They do.
You can still buy her collaboration called Keeping Memories.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's awesome.
Keeping Memories. Yeah. Yeah, we're doing like a Solera fooder there. So the idea is that we'll be able to release a few beers out of that fooder over time.
Solera fooder?
They're really amazing people. So I was excited to work with them on that project.
That's amazing. Wow. I'm really excited to try that.
Very cool.
So,
And for the people at home, hopefully it'll still be available by the time you hear this.
yeah,
Otherwise,
I
I'm
mean,
sorry for the tease.
hopefully for Avery, it sells out by the end of April, but we'll see. Wow, that's awesome. So, I think it's about the ingredients, it's about the time and the expertise and there's a lot that goes into making these specialty sorts of beers. But there are also some, maybe not mass market, but bigger market, more available beers that are, labeled as sour beers out there. Could you, Avery or Max, maybe name some of your favorites that are out there in like the Total Wines or, the groceries of the world?
Yeah, I might elaborate a little bit on just kind of like the differences in some of these styles that are currently available, especially here in the US right now. I feel like a lot of brewers would kind of classify them as like, quick sour beers and then like mixed firm barrel aged sour beers. So obviously for a barrel aged sour beer, that's something that's going to be sitting in oak for at least 6 months, if not longer, sometimes up to 3 or 5 years. And these are beers that require a fair amount of investment on the part of the brewery to produce. So these are beers that you will find in these large format bottles are going to be a bit more expensive. But what you're paying for is like the complexity in that natural fermentation with multiple microorganisms. So the acidity that develops in those beers occurs over the course of a really long period of time and is the result of action of many different types of microorganisms. The flip side of that is on some of these other beers that are considered more quick sours, beers like Berliner Weisses or fruit sours kind of as a whole, Gozas like Max talked about earlier, Berliner Weiss. These are beers that you can make over the course of, the same amount of time that you would make like an IPA, right? You can achieve that low or that high acidity, that low pH level that makes a sour beer by doing like a sour mash or a kettle sour, or by just adding lactic acid, like food grade lactic acid to your beer. So there are a lot of ways that you can do that in a very short period of time that don't require a ton of different microorganisms that you can package in cans pretty easily and pretty safely in most cases. And these are pretty readily available everywhere. So, some of my favorites over the years, Westbrook Gozo was always a favorite. I always thought that one had a really nice balance to it. It was zippy and kind of like lemonade-y, but still had a little bit of salinity to it and a little bit of like, I want to say that they do use coriander in it, but just like a pretty complex beer for being, a quick sour beer. Anderson Valley Goza is another one that's pretty widely distributed in the US, and they do lots of different fruit variants there too, like watermelon Goza. And I think they do maybe like a passion fruit one or something like that. But I've always enjoyed those too.
Yeah, same. And they do often come in like a series, or, there's like not just the Anderson Valley Goza or the Westbrook Goza, but, Westbrook they have a cucumber Goza. They have a Thai basil or something similar Goza. It's like you can do so much with that like base flavor profile that is just like lots of fun spring, summer options.
I seem to remember they did a key lime Goza a couple
years
ago. That was also like, delicious.
That's what it was.
Chef's kiss, as the kids would say. But yeah, and I think what Avery was saying about the difference in styles, and this is where it really comes back to what we were talking about earlier. Some styles lend themselves well to the quick sour methods. Things like Goza and Berliner, that more one note lactic, acidity, where you're really just craving that lower pH and what it brings to the palate. That works perfectly, and it's not too far outside of the historic tradition anyway. Something like Allagash, like an Allagash Cool Ship. Avery, I know you're drinking one of those right now. That's the other side of the spectrum. So a much more complex flavor profile, and not by any stretch of the imagination a one note pH, lactic bounce.
Right.
So, I mean, I think those were all great recommendations. Yeah, you can't go wrong with a sour beer from Allagash or from Westbrook. But also, Victory Sour Monkey, and Tart
Sour
Monkey.
Yeah.
They've got some really nice.
One of our top beers of 2020 pandemic year. It was like, oh, this is actually a great introduction to sour beer that you can find at most, beer retailers. that, if you like go back and have that beer again, it's tasty beer. It's like
For sure.
nice golden
And
sour.
that lives more in the space of not, really playing within a style guideline envelope, sort of taking a style like a Belgian triple and then just reinventing the wheel and adding some sourness to it.
Kind of crazy, actually, to have, usually I said entry point or something like that, but it's actually crazy to have a high ABV golden sour like that available in the grocery store.
I think you see a lot of brewers playing with, ignoring style guidelines when it comes to sours. And I like that too. I think.
Yeah, we have sour IPAs. I know Sixpoint does several, more of the local stuff, sour IPAs, and does Equilibrium as well? I feel like they do. I know Hudson Valley does. The sour IPA.
I know they have. I don't know how big of a part of their portfolio that is.
I have
a
specific and perhaps specific to me question. I have an issue with a lot of kettle sours or quick sours. Like you called it one note. It's like, it's a beer that sounds like it's going to be really good. It has whatever fruits in it, passion fruit, mango, and guava. But then all I taste is like the sourness. And sometimes it tastes like balloons to me, like rubber or like latex. Is that
interesting?
Normal? I mean, is there some kind of like too much lactic acid tastes like latex or rubber, or is it just me? Band-Aid kind of?
I think that that's a really interesting description of your flavor experience. For me, in beers that have that really high concentration of like purely lactic acid, like acidity, there is like a textural element to it. It's almost like a powdery kind of texture that I experience that I've always kind of described as like dried yogurt. You know what I mean? Like if you eat yogurt out of a little cup or whatever, and you like leave it out on your desk or something, and it kind of starts to dry. And you're like, oh, what is this? That for me is kind of what that flavor is. So I'm curious if that might be part of what you're talking about. I definitely feel like the acidity that develops in those types of quick sours is a pretty straightforward type of acidity that lactic kind of like, it's like playing one note as opposed to playing a chord on a piano, right? It has like, it can be clean and it can cut through your overall flavor experience, but there's not a ton in the way to like kind of dig through and explore there, which is why I think so many of those beers lend themselves to the blending with some of these tropical fruits. Cause you can have like, especially with like passion fruit and guava and lime, you can have, these are fruits that are generally associated with the flavor experience of sour, but there's all these other flavor components to it. And so you can kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of like spread that one note out and allow it to kind of manifest in a little bit more complexity without there being complexity in like acidity. But I've definitely had some that aren't that great. I've had some that were made, and I would say that like over the last several years, the quality on the whole has improved in a lot of breweries. I think, I haven't had as many quick sours or Berliner Weisses that are like, I know a typical flavor descriptor is vomity, which we might not want to use here, but that is a flavor descriptor for it.
You already have barnyard in the mix, which is like a good thing.
Kind of weird too. Yeah. I don't know. For me, like maybe vomity isn't the right word, but it definitely has that kind of like,
once again, acid. Like
that like
stomach acid,
bile. Yeah. Yeah. Or just like, it's like maybe even sometimes like papaya, you know what I mean? Papaya can, when it's like really overripe, it can definitely go the way of being kind of funky.
Yeah.
In not the greatest way. So, there's definitely like flavor associations that are different for everybody based on your food memories and experiences. But I don't think that balloon is all that out there, honestly, as like a crazy descriptor for it.
Personal trauma with balloons, maybe, that I've buried deep down. Yeah. On the whole, I'll say sour beers don't usually taste like balloons or bile. There are just so many delicious options out there. There's such a variety across all styles, across all different ingredients, food ingredients and fruits that are put into the mix. So yeah, it's a very fascinating category, or not official category, but
Subcategory.
subcategory, or just flavor category, really, of beer.
For sure. Yeah, I don't know what you're describing as balloon there either, but once we get back to a world where we can do more regular off-flavor trainings and I'm doing more sensory stuff at the brewery in Brooklyn, I'll have to get you over and we'll do some spikes and
Yes,
see if we can figure it out.
I would love that, because honestly, I didn't know it would be like this much not not shared by anyone. I was like, yeah, they probably know what I'm talking about. The balloon thing.
I've tasted that balloony latex in beer before, but I don't have an affinity for that with sour beers. I think that sometimes shows up for me as high levels of another chemical.
Yeah, maybe it is something else, and I just notice it more. Like the acidity probably amplifies whatever that is.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah, that's
for sure.
That's a me thing. But thank you both for entertaining that question and for coming on today to talk sour beers. I think hopefully that people will, after watching this, be more comfortable to check things out, ask questions, and be inspired to try all the many tart, acidic, sour beers out there. Cheers.
Thank you very much for having us. Great conversation.
You two can cheers to your beautiful sour beer.
Had a great time.
Cheers.
Cheers.